So let's spend these last few slides talking about emotions. What are emotions? Are emotions events that happen in the brain, or do they happen in the body? From which realm do they belong? Are emotions triggered by thoughts that are then felt and experienced in the body? Or are emotions triggered by the body and then rationalized and given meaning by the mind? More likely, just as we readily noted that the mind-body relationship is more complicated and can't simply be severed into two distinct parts, there's some interrelationship between the mind and the body in our experience of emotions and interpretation of emotions. So you could say that they are bodily feelings plus cognitive definitions of those feelings. You kind of need both elements in order to experience and give meaning to an emotion that you're experiencing. So what is the range of emotion? How many emotions can you feel? Is it just happy and sad at the opposite ends of the spectrum and then everything in between? Or is it more than happy or sad? Could it be exhilarated or anguished? Like, I could sit here and list emotions, but I'm not listing the emotions themselves. I'm just listing the words that represent those emotions. A feeling is a one-word thing, and that one word probably doesn't adequately capture that feeling. And going way back to de Saussure, it's arbitrary. The word anger and the combination of those five letters in that order doesn't have any natural inherent connection to what we associate with the emotion of anger. It's just a word, a socially constructed word that we use to describe it and identify it. And are emotions constructed by the biographical self in social settings from cultural building blocks, so the norms, the rules for feeling a certain way or expressing an emotion in a certain culture, and or are emotions constructed as definitions of a situation and by actors in interaction? Or are emotions innate to us? Are emotions independent of our social situation and are just released by socially learned stimuli? So just as I mentioned in the week on the body, how the body is kind of the barrier between the natural world and the cultural world, or the intersection, the convergence of the two, the place where culture and nature meet is the site of the body. You could potentially say emotions are similar in that regard, in that they're half natural, half cultural. Partly like this evolutionary mechanism, but also partially it's given meaning to within a certain social and cultural context and historical context. So emotions are socially constructed. Take that in for a second. That isn't to say that the raw, visceral sensation of feeling these emotions is what's constructed, but how we interpret these emotions and give certain socially constructed meanings to them. So for example, if someone wrongs you and treats you unjustly, emotions are likely to swell within you that you then interpret and associate with the word anger. This is a learned thing. The term anger doesn't exist in nature. We had to learn the meaning we give to this experience as the emotion of anger. So take, for example, a cave person living on Earth 5,000 years ago, and let's say someone robbed their cave and vandalized their cave drawings and stole their pet saber-toothed tiger. That cave person, in reaction to this unjust situation, is likely going to have similar sensations emerge from within them that closely resemble what we experience when we face unjust situations and describe it with the word of anger. Maybe that cave person's face would go red and their eyebrows will become furrowed and they may yell, and maybe their heart beats faster and their blood pressure rises. Not that they'd have any way of checking blood pressure or even knowing what those words mean, but it's not like the cave person is going to say them to themselves or be seen by others as being angry. Like I said, that word didn't even exist. The cave person isn't going to think to themselves that they need anger management or they need to cool down and relax or read a self-help book on controlling their emotions. These words, anger, and even emotion and their associated conceptual meanings didn't exist back then. So that our experience of that emotion of anger is socially and historically and culturally contingent. It depends on the words and frames of meaning and representation we have available to us in our language and culture. So emotions themselves are governed, our experience of emotions are governed by their own socially shared discourse through which we interpret emotions with, again, a whole discursive array of texts such as self-help books and subjects such as the therapist or the psychiatrist, or objects such as, stress balls, stress relievers, and a full array of other elements that teach us from a young age how to interpret what we're experiencing as emotions, and thus deal with those emotions and deal with ourselves in certain ways that are prescribed and legitimized by the emotional discourse. Like, it seems so natural to us. It's become fully, our interpretations of emotions have become fully naturalized so that we experience it spontaneously and naturally. We forget the fact that we learned how to interpret these emotions at one point. So this is, of course, that constructivist perspective. We're not saying that these emotions exist in real life, in nature, as the reflective model would from the week on semiotics. And to learn an emotion means several things. It kind of, once again, reminds me of the Freudian ego theory and the distinction between the id and the ego, and how babies clearly experience emotions, but they have no way of interpreting it, so they just outwardly giggle or outwardly cry. Whereas the emotions we experience as adults are more socially constrained. We keep it's like the ego's role of keeping the social context in mind, the reality principle in mind, the fact that there are other people around us who may find it weird that we're giggling outwardly or crying outwardly. So we learn rules of feeling over time. And these rules for feeling emotions and expressing emotions are, again, culturally specific. So some cultures are seen as more passionate and more freely expressing their emotions, such as cultures in South American countries, compared to maybe Russian or Chinese cultures that may seem more constrained in the expression of emotions. So the level of intensity with which you are experiencing emotions is culturally dependent, but also situationally specific. So if you're feeling bad that a job interview didn't go well, you probably wouldn't start crying in the job interview itself. You'd probably wait till you get home and you're alone, and then you can start bawling your eyes out. So the intensity to which you are experiencing and expressing that sadness depends on the direct situation you find yourselves in. And again, we narrativize emotions because emotions are often emerging from that realm of nature, that inexplicable, chaotic, tumultuous aspect of human existence that doesn't make us feel comfortable because we can't readily explain it. Like, imagine how frustrating that would be if you experienced anger or sadness or fear and weren't able to give a meaning to it. So being just like a diagnosis gives us comfort in being able to give what we're experiencing a name, same thing with the models of emotions that we have applied to our lives. We fill our emotions with social content, and we give socially constructed meanings to these raw, visceral emotions that we're experiencing. So there's an entire self-help industry that provides models of emotion that we learn and use to define and perhaps even alter our experience of emotions. So this isn't just something that occurs in primary school at a very young age. We learn how to deal with our emotions and interpret them over the course of our lives. And self-help books play that important role to the extent that they offer social scripts for the feeling and expression of emotions. It provides you with the stories you can tell to yourself regarding your own emotions, and the socially acceptable scripts for performing an emotion. And the majority of popular self-help books rely on one particular model of emotion. So there are various models of emotion that we can adapt and take for ourselves and apply to our own emotions. But if you read a lot of self-help books, then there's one model that often emerges in a lot of the shared literature, and that's the folk psychoanalytic model. So it's like a more layman and accessible and common sense version of psychoanalysis. It's like psychoanalysis for dummies. Whatever happened to those For Dummies books? I never see them anymore. I guess we've gotten rid of all the dummies in our society, or more likely people didn't want to own books in their collection whose title indicates that they are in fact a dummy. So the folk psychoanalytic model proposes and formulates 7 elements regarding the model of emotion. So firstly, emotions are powerful and can influence the whole of your life. and the specific origins of emotions are not always intuitively obvious. You may need to dig a bit deeper using that principle of psychoanalysis to unearth the origin and source of an emotion. Thirdly, any repression of emotions doesn't allow them to vent or dissipate. They are instead retained. We hold on to them, and they're perhaps sublimated into different forms. They kind of are diverted and emerge in different areas of ourselves, and they may become more intensified over time. This is what Freud was worried about with the repression of the id, and not surprisingly, Freud largely founded the field of psychoanalysis. So this is like a poor man's Freud. And so because repressed emotions can lead to self-destruction, emotions must be addressed or dealt with according to the folk psychoanalytic model. But luckily, according to this model, emotions are targetable by self-help and therapeutic and rational or potentially spiritual manipulation. And sixthly, social encounters are characterized by either a reciprocity of emotions, where people are sharing similar emotions, which is usually beneficial, and or a conflict of emotions, which is usually detrimental. But again, conflicting emotions between people can be worked out through self-help. So the Ryan reading actually notes evidence that the folk psychoanalytic model described in the previous slide is being grafted on to a heavily medicalized addiction model previously applied to various forms of substance abuse. So that all those principles listed on the previous slide just replace emotion with addiction. And that's how a lot of addiction recovery programs are structured, arguably to the detriment of those who are actually trying to recover from very serious addictions. And there's a mutual influence here because the self-help industry has latched on to this idea of addiction recovery. And there's been a proliferation of self-help books based on being addicted to anything within everyday life. Not just drug or substance abuse, but shopping addiction or sex addiction or work addiction or food addiction or exercise addiction. Every even slightly problematic thing in one's everyday life is reframed as an addiction that requires recovery. Like the word codependence used to exclusively belong to the field of addiction recovery, of problematic life situations where a drug addict is living with another drug addict and they kind of enable each other and depend on each other and reinforce each other's addictions to the detriment of both of them. But codependency has since been co-opted by self-help literature. So now people can be seen or see themselves as codependent if they're addicted to exercise and whoever they're living with is also addicted to exercise and they're both codependently enabling each other. Or if one person has a shopping addiction and the other person has a car that takes them to the mall every day, then they're codependent. So this strategy has served the self-help industry very well as more and more behaviors become redefined